My name's George McCarran. I am an economist at the University of Sussex and a co-founder of a company called Psychological Technologies. And what I want to talk to you about today is what's written in your agenda, but more specifically, I want to talk to you about peaks, valleys, and our happiness. And I have a double meaning in mind, because I want to talk both about the peaks and valleys in our happiness, as well as our happiness in the peaks and valleys of the natural world and other kinds of natural environments. Along the way, we'll also look at how work and crime and football impact our happiness and what that tells us about our happiness over space and through time. But first of all, I want to start with Francis Edgeworth, a political philosopher, a statistician, political economist of the 19th century. And if anyone in this room has studied economics, they're probably familiar with the Edgeworth box, which is a diagram for representing a sort of simple competitive system. But in the same publication in 1881, where Edgeworth described his box, he also asked us to imagine this. He said, imagine an ideally perfect instrument, a psychophysical machine, continually registering the height of pleasure experienced by an individual. From moment to moment, the hedonometer varies. The delicate index now flickering with the flutter of the passions, now steadied by intellectual activity, low sunk whole hours in the neighborhood of zero, or momentarily springing up towards infinity. So as long ago as 1881, Edgeworth has this slightly extraordinary idea that we could understand happiness better if we could build some kind of machine that could continuously monitor it for us. Now, about 100 years pass, and researchers in the 1970s realized that they can begin to implement this idea using the technology of the 1970s, which is paper forms and pages. And if you were in this conference, this summit, 2 years ago, you might have heard Mihaly talk about his work on experience sampling in the measurement of flow. Now, in the 1970s, with this technology, you could reach a few dozen people for a few weeks. But of course, smartphones in around the last 10 years have enabled us to reach tens, hundreds of thousands of people at millions of points in time. And that gives us something qualitatively new. And so I'm here today to talk about my study, Mappiness. Actually, I was also going to say, if you were here 2 years ago, you might have heard Matt Killingsworth talk about his study, trackyourhappiness.org. And so these ideas of bringing smartphones bring us closer than ever before to Edgeworth's ideal of a hedonometer. So Mappiness is an app. It pings people. It asks them how they feel. It takes their satellite location. It takes the timestamp. It asks them a few other things that we might want to control for. We had around 4 million people give us around 66,000 people give us around 4 million responses to Mappiness. And it's not Edgeworth's idea in the sense that it's a continuous reading from everyone, but across everyone, it is a continuous reading. And for each individual, we have a representative sample of the moments in their life, which helps us to understand what it is that forms those peaks and valleys in the happiness trace that we see on my slides. Now, you might be thinking, how is this different from what happiness researchers more typically do? What's different about this? Well, this is not overall life satisfaction. Often, happiness economists particularly will analyze life satisfaction data. And that's a question that you ask people, how satisfied are you in general with your life nowadays? And that's reassuringly stable, that quantity. That doesn't change very much from week to week, month to month, even from year to year. And that gives us a good idea that it's valid data, but it also means it's not terribly helpful for understanding what are the impacts of the everyday events of our lives. So we don't have life satisfaction data. What we've got is something different. It's momentary happiness. The other thing this is different from is data collected from social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook and so on. Because on those platforms, people choose a moment to tell us how they feel, and they're choosing to tell us how they feel. They're not necessarily recording how they feel personally for their own purposes. And so it's kind of performative. So our data is volatile, unlike life satisfaction, and it's personal, it's not performative, unlike social media. And those two things make it really powerful for some of the purposes that I will show you now. So I put this chart up a minute ago. It's almost like a seismograph, this idea of Edgeworth's, that we would measure happiness moment to moment. It kind of looks like the tremors of an earthquake. But this is real data. This is real happiness data for the UK over the course of about a year. And If I add some labels, it might make a little bit more sense to you. So the scale goes from 0, somewhere down here underneath the floor, to 100, somewhere around the ceiling, and that corresponds to people sliding all the way to the left in our app to say they're not at all happy, or all the way to the right to say that they're extremely happy. You can see that Christmas in 2010 was an extremely happy event. Christmas every year in the UK is a very happy time. Easter was also good, and Easter was better than usual because the weather was great. And I've just come from rain and snow, and we appreciate good weather the 3 times a year that we have it in the UK. You can see that the royal wedding in 2011 was also a very popular event. People getting married whom we didn't know still made some of us very, very happy. If we move on for another year, you can see that Christmas again is extremely happy. You can see that some certain sporting fixtures make a big difference to how people feel. These are just raw averages, so there's nothing controlled for here. These are just raw averages from moment to moment in the UK. And in terms of scaling, you can see that the general peaks and valleys have around 5 percentage points between them. There's about a 5 percentage point range there. And then that time that we're really happy at Christmas is sort of an extra 5 points above your typical peak. And that sort of helps you calibrate perhaps some of the things that I'm going to talk about now. So that's some really simple descriptives of the UK's happiness over time. I haven't put in any valleys today. I haven't labeled any of the valleys in our happiness because this is an upbeat kind of presentation, but actually I can reveal that we do have some labeled valleys. Can anyone guess what the worst day for our Mappiness responses was? I couldn't make anything of that. I'll tell you what the worst day was. It was when we discovered who had been elected President of the United States. And I can tell you that the 4th worst day was when we discovered how we'd voted in the Brexit referendum. And it's true that our respondents are not representative. These are people who select in with their iPhones. On the other hand, I'm not sure that this result would be any different, because it might well be, and this is something that we'll see later, that the people who lost on those occasions felt much more strongly about it than the people who won, and that the people who are going to be deprived of their free movement between many countries cared more about that than the people who are going to get to change the color of their passport. So, here we've got the data described, but what causes these peaks and valleys? And this pattern, some of you may have been able to deduce from this pattern what a really key influence is. And a really key influence here is work. And this is something of a paradox, because we know from life satisfaction data that having work is very important positively to people's life satisfaction. But we've also established very strongly that being at work is a very negative influence on people's momentary happiness. If you recall the slide that we just saw, there are small peaks and the small valleys correspond to weekdays and weekends. Weekdays, people are working, weekends, people are not. And the big peaks are Christmas and Easter, when even fewer people than at weekends are working. And so those biggest peaks in happiness correspond to the times when fewest people are currently at work. And the size of that work effect is about 5 percentage points. So people are about 5 percentage points less happy when they're at work than when they're not at work. I'm not going to show you any big regression tables, but this does come from a big, proper research study. We have fixed effects, so we're looking at the impact on the same people when they're working versus when they're not working, and we're also controlling for a whole range of other influences on their happiness, including who they're with, what else they're doing, the time of day, the day of the week, where they are, and so on. And many of those things actually are independently negative. Many of those other aspects that are associated with work also make people less happy than when they don't obtain. So you might say, the typical economist approach to this is to say, well, we know that work is disutility, that's why we pay people to do it. And, to some extent that's true, but we spend an awful lot of time at work. If we could make people even a tiny amount happier in their working lives, that would make a very big difference to a very large number of people, which is why we're currently using our technology, currently with some organizations in the UK and hopefully in future beyond, both to measure happiness and well-being so that organizations can discover what they can do systematically, the level of the whole system, to make people feel better in their work. And we also then give feedback to the individuals to understand their well-being at work and to do kind of, short-term things that might help. Short tools such as mindfulness, CBD practices, longer-term courses, and so on. And of course, this also has a really important productivity element. It really should be that whatever we spend on doing this, we reap many times over in the productivity gains that it produces. So we've established that work is the #1 cause of peaks and valleys. Now we'll come back to peaks and valleys. What do peaks and valleys do to our happiness? And the reason I bring this up is partly that this was what the Mappiness study was originally designed to answer. Because we take the GPS location when someone gives us an answer, we have really good objective data on what kind of environment people are in. So this is, for example, London as seen in the Land Cover Map 2000. We now use the Land Cover Map 2007. You can see central London is mostly black because it's mostly the continuous urban land cover. But you might spot a little rectangle of Hyde Park, for example, and so we can see if people are in trees, in grassland, farmland, valleys, peaks, and so on. Of course, again, we run this in a large regression where we have fixed effects. We're looking at the same people in one place versus another place. We're looking at who they're with, what they're doing. Now, of course, also, it may be an important influence both on people's happiness and on whether they choose to go into nature, what the weather conditions are like. And so we also take weather data for the right time and the right place. And we have findings around that. But here I'm just talking about those as controls. And after we've controlled for all of that, these are our main results. These are our results around the kinds of land cover that we get in the UK. And the short message is that all kinds of natural environments are happier than cities, even after we've made all those kinds of controls. And the next short message is that of those kinds of environments, by some considerable distance, marine and coastal margins are the happiest kinds of natural environments. And that's essentially wetlands and estuaries. Wetlands and estuaries make people about 6 percentage points happier than cities do. And that's a bigger difference than any of the other kinds of natural environments. And again, this is a robust finding. We've got various kinds of robustness checks. It's very significant statistically. The one thing that we don't have on this is causality, because people choose to go into natural environments. It's difficult to convince people that this is a causal effect. Although actually in the last hour, I met a guy called Will, ex-NASA, who is taking satellite photos of the Earth every day and sometimes 6 times a day. And that's exactly the kind of data that might give us the changes, the external changes that we might need to see how much of these effects are causal. And intuitively, I think probably quite a lot of these effects are causal, but we could show that scientifically. And that's a very exciting thought. In the meantime, though, we've had to look at other kinds of data to be sure that the effects that we're seeing are causal. Data not on nature, data on some other phenomena. And the two things that I'm going to talk to you about that we think are causal because we have external variation are crime and football. Crime, I have some work with Alex Bryson at UCL, where we have some information on high-profile crimes in Northern Ireland. And we find very local effects over a very short time, but we find that up to 13 percentage points are taken off people's happiness only within 5 kilometres and only between about 24 and 72 hours after these events. We also have a much bigger data set from Thames Valley Police of perhaps more ordinary crimes. And my PhD student, Panka Benkchik, has again shown that you can relate individual incidents to individual happiness responses and show that, on average, there's a significant effect on more or less the same street about 2 days later. It's not an immediate effect. It takes time to percolate into people's consciousness. But we see what we are pretty certain is a causal impact there. And that's, again, I guess, something that we can add to sort of the social cost of crimes happening that we couldn't see if we only looked even at a whole city, let alone a whole country, in the data. The last thing that I want to talk about is football. And you may remember that in the data for 2012, people in the UK were quite happy when they won the football. And so with my colleague Peter Dalton at Sussex, we started looking at this in some more detail. And again, the nice thing about football is it represents an external shock to people's well-being, a positive shock or a negative shock, but they don't control it. And if we partial out the expectations on the match from the odds that were given before kickoff, it really is a random shock. And so then we can see how people respond to what happens in any particular game. Now, how do we do this? Because we didn't ask people at any point whether they were interested in football. But we did have an activity where people could tell us that they were at a match or a sporting event. And so if we join up 2 other data sets, a data set on the locations of all the major football stadia in the UK, and a data set on which team was playing which other team, on which date, at which time, what the odds were, and what happened, and at what minute each thing happened, we can firstly identify people who are football supporters because we see them either at 2 matches that have a team in common, and that's the team they support, or at 1 match and we assume that they're home supporters. That gives us about 500 people that we think are interested in the results for a particular team. And then we can follow the responses of those 500 people over the whole football season, which is about 4,000 matches of interest to the 500 people that we can look at. And then we can essentially create a hedonimeter using that data. We can look at the time before the match. So rather than this being a whole year now, this is a few hours. It starts 2 hours before the match. There's the 0 point when the match is played. I'm not showing you data from the match today, but it follows exactly this pattern according to what your team, what the score is for your team at the time that you respond. And then the 4 hours, 5 hours, I should say, after the match. So before the match, there's a small anticipation effect. There's a sort of 1.5 points plus on your happiness score. Now what happens if I win? Well, unsurprisingly, I'm happy if I win. And that's a reasonably big effect. It's a 4-point positive effect. It doesn't last that long. So it seems perhaps it lasts the rest of the day. The significance is marginal, but it's only down to a sort of 1 or 2 point level. If I lose, by contrast, the effect is much bigger. The effect is -8. And actually, if I hadn't rounded these, you see the negative effect is even slightly bigger than twice the magnitude of the positive effect. And this is interesting because this gives us kind of experienced utility confirmation of loss aversion. Right? These people perhaps who lost in a referendum versus who gained, maybe those people who lost felt a lot worse. Certainly people in football matches, when their team lose, feel an awful lot more negative than the positive emotion they feel when they win. And I said that we had the odds data. We know what the expectation was before the match, and so we can break this loss out into an expected versus an unexpected loss. And perhaps, again, as you would expect, the unexpected loss is very much more painful than the expected loss. If we expected it, it was only maybe -6. If we didn't expect it, then on average it was -10. And we can get even bigger effects than this, because if people were at the stadium, for example, and if they really didn't expect that loss, this coefficient would be getting towards being ill in bed. So that the worst thing people can tell us in Mappiness is that they're ill in bed, and that's around -20. But we're getting close with some of these impacts from football games. For completeness, what happens if I draw? Well, that's a minor disappointment. It doesn't last very long. That's about -3. But what this says that's quite interesting, certainly to economists, is that people look like they're going to come out behind on this deal, right? Sometimes we're going to win, sometimes we're going to lose. But if the losses hurt us much more than the wins make us feel good, then in general we're going to be, on average, a little bit more miserable as football fans than we will as non-football fans, which obviously means that I made the right choice in not supporting any kind of team. But I think it's also interesting to have that confirmation of loss aversion in the experience data, because often loss aversion we take as a decision utility metric. People make this choice to avoid losses or to take losses. But here we see in the happiness data that losses hurt a lot more than victories make us feel good. And that's a little bit of a puzzle for the traditional economics way of thinking about things, because Edgeworth himself, when he introduced this hedonimeter, told us that the total of happiness is just the area under the line. And therefore, what we would imagine that people are trying to maximize is that total area, or that mean. And yet that doesn't seem to be what football supporters are doing. Given the choice between a profile that looks like this, that has small peaks and even bigger valleys, or a profile like this, which lacks the peaks, but it also lacks the valleys, and therefore has a higher mean and a higher total, football supporters seem to be choosing this number 2. And now, there's a very wide range of possible explanations, and I don't want to promise you that this is the answer by any means, but I do think it's interesting that I think this data may show us that people are just as interested in the size of the peaks, and maybe even the size of the valleys, as they are in the mean or the total. This came out at a conference paper, and I had about 10 local radio interviews lined up back-to-back one morning, and in almost every case, they lined me up against someone who could then reminisce for several minutes about an extraordinary victory that the local team had enjoyed at some point in maybe the last 50 years. And it got me thinking, so maybe the experience is not the only thing that we care about. We're willing to take a lot of these valleys just for one peak that we can talk about to people around us who care in the same way that we do. So that's mainly what I want to talk to you about, but I do want to encourage you to sign up for the next version of Mappiness, Mappiness 2.0, where we will be working around the world, and we will also be trying to make people happier, thanks to my co-founder Nick Begley, who used to work for Headspace. And so if you visit mappiness.app, you can give us your email address, mappiness.app, and we will email you with more information when that is ready. Thank you very much.